My first long, as it were, experience of working with Orest Subtelny was in 2001, 2002, when we arrived to live in Canada, and we moved to Toronto in March of 2001. Orest had begun a project with Canadian government money from CIDA, based at York University, which was involved with the Canadian assistance in training Ukrainian diplomats and Ukrainian foreign policy experts. And so he brought me in as the kind of administrator, if you want, a project manager of this CIDA project, which was for quite a few years based at York University. We had quite a few Ukrainians coming through, primarily, I would say, from institutions such as the Diplomatic Academy. They were brought to the Canadian equivalent of the Diplomatic Academy for various forms of training, and also in various forms of training in different types of social media as well. And then Orest would also travel to Ukraine as part of that entire project. It was quite fascinating to watch that in progress. Orest, being an academic, was not always the best organized of persons, but that is par for the course of all academics. They're not the best managers. But it was a fascinating project to see, as it were, how Ukrainian foreign policy experts could operate in the environment. And I remember one of the most interesting aspects of that was looking at doing seminars which compared Ukrainian Russian relations to American Canadian relations. In many ways, Ukrainian Russian and American Canadian relations are very similar. You have a small country next to a big elephant. At the same time, they are extremely different because back in 2001, 2000, a large number of Ukrainians still had a kind of a post-colonial perspective, in many ways an inferiority perspective, vis-a-vis the former colonial master, Russia. That wasn't the case for West Ukrainians, but it was for many other Ukrainians. And so it was a kind of an unequal relationship. Whereas as I became more and more aware, looking at Canadian-American relations, Canadians have a superiority complex, not an inferiority complex, a superiority complex vis-a-vis Americans. So that was kind of fascinating to see how a country with a smaller population could actually look down upon America with its big population. And that was reinforced because at the time in 2001, I was watching Rick Mercer's Talking to Americans, which poked fun. It seems to be a Canadian obsession poking fun at Americans, which, of course, with Trump as a potential next U.S. president, is going to be even more the case today. So that was fascinating to compare the two. Even there were some similarities, but a lot of differences between Canada, U.S., and Russia, Ukraine. The other aspect, of course, was looking at Orest Subtelny and within the context of Ukrainian historians and Ukrainian academics in Toronto and Canada. And after 2001, living in Canada, I got to know both Orest Subtelny on the one hand and, of course, Professor Paul Robert Magocsi on the other. And in that kind of relationship, there was a lot of interesting kind of background and a lot of interesting comparisons that I came to realize and came to understand. What to me was fascinating was to see how I arrived, in effect, after about 2 decades of Professor Magocsi being the chairholder of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto. The situation was still not great in terms of his relationship with the Ukrainian diaspora, but it was beginning to mellow a bit. But I came to understand how Orest Subtelny was the actual, the favorite academic for the Ukrainian diaspora to be hired back in 1980 for that position. I mean, when the Ukrainian diaspora raised the money, they actually wanted Subtelny to be the chairholder. Of course, they didn't realize, the Ukrainian diaspora didn't realize that it's actually the university that decides this, not the Ukrainian diaspora that provides the money. And there was a lot of antagonism during that competition for the chairholder, particularly between Orest Subtelny and Frank Sysyn, and letters flying back and forth between them and the university administration. Ironically, Magocsi never applied for the job, but the university asked him to apply after all of this acrimonious debate between the established Ukrainian diaspora historians. And in the end, he got the job. The interesting aspect of all this was that the person who was leading this battle against Professor Magocsi at the University of Toronto was none other than Borys Wrzesnewskyj, who's now a member of parliament, because he was then the head of the Ukrainian Students' Club at the University of Toronto. And he never talked to Magocsi again ever since then. It was me that broke the ice between Borys and Professor Magocsi. And in, I think, about 2009, when I brought them together, it broke the ice, as I say, and Borys Wrzesnewskyj from his family foundation provided the funding for a Polish translation of Magocsi's History of Ukraine, which will come out this year in Poland. So, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Borys's family foundation also funded Magocsi's 2014 book, which was the first history of the Crimean Tatars. So there you are. I mean, it needed a Brit to come to Toronto to reconcile these warring parties. So it was interesting to watch these dynamics, as it were, as an outsider, and who had not been part of this tension back in the early 80s. Well, since 2009, everything has changed. Of course, Professor Magocsi and the Ukrainian diaspora have basically reconciled. Professor Magocsi tells me himself jokingly that now one of his strongest supporters in Toronto is the editor of Homin Ukraine. Can you believe it? So there you are. What is the differences between them? Well, the crucial difference, and I'm not sure many members of the Ukrainian diaspora quite always understood this, the differences between these two histories of Ukraine, Orest Subtelny's and Paul Robert Magocsi's, is in terms of approach. They appeared at different times, relatively speaking. Orest Subtelny was in many ways lucky, as it were. He published, 4 editions of his history came out. It's an incredible achievement. University of Toronto Press should be congratulated for bringing both of their histories out. These are the 2 main histories of Ukraine that have appeared in the last quarter of a century of Ukraine's independence. Whatever happened to Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute? Professor Szporluk was supposed to have written the history of Ukraine and never did. So the 2 influential histories were Subtelny and Magocsi. Subtelny's was lucky because he came out in English in his first edition in 1989, and the first Ukrainian language edition, which I have here, came out in 1991. So when the USSR still existed. It was published in Kiev by Libid Press in Kiev. And at that time in 1991, this was a bombshell because of many reasons. Firstly, the Ukrainian historians in Ukraine itself had not had the time yet, for obvious reasons, to begin writing their own histories of Ukraine without the Communist Party's influence. So that took 5, 6, 7 years for them to do that. And so his history of Ukraine became a massive bestseller. I mean, when these books are sold in the West, academic books, I mean, they don't get more than 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 copies, and usually it's libraries that buy them, not usually individuals. In Ukraine, we were talking about hundreds of thousands of copies were being sold and reprinted illegally. He told me this himself. Orest Subtelny says, I don't care the fact that, hundreds of thousands. He quoted me a figure that together the Russian and Ukrainian translations of his History of Ukraine reached something like close to 1 million copies. This is the Russian language edition of his History of Ukraine. It appeared in 1994. Again, Libed. It's very good that it appeared in Russian because it was read in Eastern Ukraine and read maybe in Russia. But together, these two editions, the Ukrainian and Russian editions, were, as it were, reprinted in some ways like samizdat, or illegally, without anybody asking about copyright. But they reached a massive, huge number. I remember I was on a government project, a U.S. government project in Donetsk in 1994, and at the university in Donetsk, this was the textbook they were using, Orest Subtelny's, because there were no textbooks or histories of Ukraine written by Ukrainian historians since 1991. So he got in at the right time, and because of that, he had a great amount of influence. Professor Magocsi's History of Ukraine only appeared in 1996, and the Ukrainian edition in 1997. So it was kind of a bit later down the road. What's the difference approach between them? This is very, very important. When Orest Subtelny wrote his History of Ukraine in the late 80s, I mean, if it came out in 89, he must have begun writing it in about 87, around that time, maybe 86. He was writing it as though he was a Mikhailo Hrushevsky, in the sense that Ukraine was not a state. It was a part of the Soviet Union. So he was writing it in the same way as Hrushevsky was writing a history of Ukraine. It wasn't a history of a state, it was a history of a Ukrainian people. It was a history of a stateless people. And therefore, it's a history of Ukrainians, Hrushevsky's and Subtelny's, the history of Ukrainians. So he followed in the Hrushevsky mold in that sense. Magocsi approached it very differently. He was writing in the 90s when Ukraine was an independent state, and his approach is different anyway. So he's writing it more similar to typical European or Western histories of countries. I mean, when you look at a history of say, France or Britain, it's a history of that territory that we today know as France and Britain. Everything that happened in that territory. So it's more of a civic as opposed to a civic-territorial as opposed to a ethno-cultural history. And in that sense, Hrushevsky Subtelny's is a history of Ukrainian people, not really looking at, say, Russians, Poles, Jews in Ukraine, whereas Magocsi's is a history of everything that's happened on Ukrainian territory. This is particularly in his second edition, and that includes, of course, the Jews, Crimean Tatars, Russians, Poles, and others. So it's a history of Ukrainian territory. So that was a different approach between them, and in that sense, they complemented each other. You had a history of Ukrainian people and a history of the Ukrainian state, and that actually provided for a completely exhaustive and overhaul overview of Ukrainian history, written by two historians, both based at the University in Toronto, and both published by the University of Toronto Press. One of the final times I did some kind of work with Orest Subtelny would have been in the latter part of 2009, because then I was doing some work for the Yulia Tymoshenko campaign in Kiev. I thought that this was a crucial election campaign. In many ways, I think it's similar to the election campaign in today's USA between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. where you might not like Hillary Clinton very much, and she has very high negative ratings, just like Trump, but at the same time, anything is better than Trump. And in that sense, I thought the same in 2010, that anything would be better than the coming to power of Viktor Yanukovych. But, of course, not everybody agreed with that in 2009, 2010, and hence Tymoshenko lost. But I organized a forum of Western experts in Kiev, to which came and attended Yulia Tymoshenko. And at that Western forum, everybody was really attending. I mean, there was Professor Magocsi, Orest Subtelny, there were other academics from the political science as well as historians. You had about 40 people, and this was the creme de la creme of all the big names, like Andrew Wilson from Britain, for example, who Lucan Way and Henry Hale from the US, people who cover Ukraine from history and political science fields. And Orest Subtelny was there. I remember that Yulia Tymoshenko singled him out in the room because she had obviously... He was a well-known commodity, shall we say, in Ukraine. I think all of Ukraine's politicians who had emerged in the 1990s had all read his History of Ukraine. That was their first book on Ukrainian history that they read in the post-Soviet period. She approached him and hugged him and congratulated him. And he took a very, very active part in the two-day event that we organized. He came out openly. Not all the experts did, but he came out openly in support of Tymoshenko because the alternative, as he put it, was the mafia Viktor Yanukovych, which I agreed with at the time. So that showed to a great extent that he wasn't just an ivory tower academic, in the same way as it showed it when he was doing the York University project on behalf of CIDA that I was involved in. He was more than just an ivory tower academic historian. He was also a community activist. He was also active in Ukraine in various different projects. He attended various forums where he spoke. In that sense, I think he'll be remembered in a variety of ways by different people. He certainly kind of left us, sadly, of course, with a bang. The fact that his History of Ukraine had such a tremendous impact on the emerging Ukrainian state and emerging Ukrainian national identity in the 1990s is certainly a tribute to him. And I would think a huge proportion of today's Ukraine's ruling elites, politicians, state builders, civil servants, all read his work in the 1990s. Think of it, if 1 million copies were printed, then we're talking about 3-4 million people who have read it. Because, one person's not going to read it, they're going to pass it around their family, friends, and such like. That's a huge number of people. And in English, a publishing house like the University of Toronto Press is not going to keep reprinting a book into 4 editions unless there's a public demand for it. And so within the shape of a period from the first edition in 1989 to the 4th edition, which was in 2005, I believe. That book also influenced a lot of people in the Western world. When I came to Canada, he was already on his 3rd edition, which came out in 2001, 2002, which I helped him to edit and bring up to date. So Orest Subtelny will be fondly remembered by many of us. There are many tributes to him coming out in Ukraine. And he's somebody that we all will remember him for having contributed to Ukrainian state and nation building at a crucial time in the 1990s when people on the ground in Ukraine had not yet had the ability to, as it were, prepare their own texts and histories themselves. And they needed that help from the Ukrainian diaspora, and he was there at that time, at the right time, to provide that. So he will be somebody who will be remembered for that on the part of many people. Thank you.